and welcome to the Cuyamaga Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robert, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. The Cuyamaga Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness and the supporting of the rediscovery of the ancient practice of ecstatic trance postures. And it was the insightful work of our founder, Dr. Felicitas Goodman, anthropologist, who found the clues and revived the practice. She searched the oldest evidence available, which she discovered in the world's collection of prehistory and indigenous art, and decoded these selected artifacts as ritual instructions. And as an educational institution, we recognize the Thrive. We take an open approach and we invite scholars of parallel research and related fields to help us broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. Today, we're going to be talking about our own work in more depth, but generally we've been having these broad discussions, full spectrum from neuroscience, mysticism, trance states, anthropology, art history, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, shamanism, wisdom traditions, sacred landscapes, dance, mythology, on and on and on.
Eco-spirituality.
Yeah. Visit our website, cuyamagainstitute.com. Many of these presentations have been recorded and are available for free. And as a nonprofit, we invite you to become a supporting member, and we thank the community members who continue to support the mission of the Cuyamaga Institute. Like I mentioned, today we want to look at the core of our own work, the research of altered states of consciousness, many times abbreviated as just simply ASC, and the practice of ecstatic trance postures. Altered states of consciousness, ecstatic trance, what does this mean? I mean, we need to define some terms before we can go more deeply into the science behind these experiences. In the last 50 years, there's been advances in philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and anthropology, and there's an evolution of terms to describe these non-ordinary states. I remember in Dr. Goodman's earlier work in her writings in the 1960s and 70s, she kept referring to the religious altered state or the religious trance state, later evolving to different terms as the work continued. So this morning, just before we began, I Googled the term, what's the definition of ecstatic trance? I mean, that's what we call the posture work that we do. And according to the dictionary of the American Psychological Association, an altered state of consciousness characterized by joy and happiness, it's often associated with various religious practices, intense meditation, certain emotional styles of worship.
That covers it.
See also mysticism. So, Laura, let's lay some groundwork to put this discussion in a perspective.
We want to introduce the topic and then our guests who will help us illuminate this subject. So the question, what is ecstatic trance? What is religious trance? More pertinently, how did previous generations of anthropologists use the term? Because they did, and widely, as applied to shamans and soul flight. And how has the term changed in common usage? Well, we were asked that question by Lawson Molnori. He's an ethnomusicology student, and he was including our work, Cuyamaga Institute's work, through his own observation, his own participation in our ecstatic trance posture sessions for his thesis. And he said, I'm using this term, but I really don't know what it means. And how has it changed? I've been looking at the previous generations. I'm like, yeah, they use it. Mircea Eliade uses it. Dr. Goodman used it. What did they mean by it? Well, I think the meaning has changed. And I think part of it is because now we're engaged in the practice, whereas previous generations of anthropologists may have looked at the practice, looked at what the shaman said about it, looked at the history of this. With the exception of Dr. Goodman, she dove right into it. We're now engaged in the practice, and it changes when you have direct experience. It's also interesting that this has become more mainstream and widely accepted. It's society picking up what we once lost. We have, through the vagaries of history and time, lost the practice that was once so central to all societies. And we'll briefly touch on later today a study that Dr. Goodman was involved in that really demonstrated that Indigenous societies embraced altered states widely as the core of their identity, their culture, their practice, their understanding of the world. So the question is, how did we in the West lose it? And isn't it that everything outside our narrow band range is looked at as an aberration, as something odd, as forbidden turf? Well, those times have changed. And now we have Michael Pollan with How to Change Your Mind, a popular book. We have Tim Ferriss with Stealing Fire, Implication is from the Gods, a popular work. We have Joe Rogan all over ecstasy and means to get there. And so quietly, this institute for the past 50 years, since Dr. Goodman did her initial experimentation and found there are many, many ways of achieving these states. They're spontaneous. That shows you just how common and normal these states are. Many of us, myself included, from childhood, been having mystical moments widely. And there's so many ways of achieving these states, from plant medicine to various religious practices around the globe. She revived but one. And she was very happy to be one drop in a whole ocean of forward motion to this. And she would say that this is so instilled in our physiology, so built into us, that you can take away all knowledge of this previously, and we will still find a way there. And indeed, you can see rave dances, electronic music, just all the means that we have of achieving these states. So the points that we want to cover today are, one, it's maybe not common, because what we are doing with this work and how she would describe it, Dr. Goodman would describe it, was we have one foot in our ordinary reality, while simultaneously we are placing another foot in this non-ordinary reality. So we are stepping outside the ordinary into the non-ordinary, into the alternative reality. And a couple of key words: non-ordinary doesn't mean not normal. It's not common because we've lost the practice, but it is normal. It is a normal capacity of our physiology to go into these states. It is not an aberration. It's not a pathology. It's not a mental illness. That was, in my opinion, a view based on it being lost and therefore not common. Ignorance, yeah. But we'll elucidate this with our guest today. And so basically this normal capacity is right there for the undertaking, there built into our physiology. The fact that, and I took a few notes here, the fact that mystical states are achievable by everyone. They're not for mystics only. It's not for the turf of only certain religions or only certain cultures. It's there and it's universal. And so you can trace this far, far back in time, and we've had those discussions. And so when I wanted to mention, we're here thanks to my sister Kimberly in her beautiful barn, a section of her barn. And we've been her guest for 6 weeks, and we're about to depart. So everything is packed up and we're ready to depart early tomorrow morning. But I held one book back, one small book back, and the Varieties of Religious Experience with William James, written in the 1960s. I just wanted to read one passage from that, because I think that when we want to step outside our own work, our own Dr. Goodman, we know what she has to say. But we really want to widen this topic up. And that's why we've invited our guest today, who I'll introduce in a moment. We want to really widen this to say that our work is part of the broader range of altered states and ecstatic states. Ecstasy being ecstasis, stepping outside that common, that norm, and yet within the capacity of what is normal. And here I just want to look at another source, a widely respected source, to say, yeah, it's normal. So he hits on it as being normal, healthy, and beyond the bounds of science as we know it. Because that's the other deterrent, is for science to say, oh, I'm sorry, but what you see is what you get here. This is all that there is, what is touchable, what is concrete to our senses. And here's another source to say, no, it goes far beyond that. William James writes, "The whole drift of my education goes to persuade me that the world of our present consciousness is only one out of the many worlds of consciousness that exist, and that those other worlds must contain experiences which have a meaning for our life also, and that although in the main their experiences and those of this world keep discrete, meaning not common, yet the two become continuous at certain points and higher energies filter in. We call those the spirits. I can, of course, put myself into the sectarian scientist attitude and imagine vividly that the world of sensations and of scientific laws and objects may be all. But whenever I do this, I hear that inward monitor whispering, bosh, humbug is humbug, even though it bear the scientific name. And the total expression of human beyond the narrow scientific bounds. Assuredly, the real world is of a different temperament, more intrinsically built than physical science allows. So we go to turn to multiple sources to look at this question and to ask very clearly, so what is ecstatic trance? How has the meaning changed over time? And why has anthropology of the past, or our own culture of the past, considered this such forbidden turf and deemed it outside the norm and outside where we should go?
Yeah.
So I want to introduce today's guests. You know them if you've been regular attendees of our sessions, and they come from anthropology, both cultural and cognitive. They've got both sides covered. They are the husband-wife team teaching at the University of Missouri. They are Todd and Christine VanPool, and Christine in particular has direct experience of our work and so can speak from both sides of that. So welcome back, you two, and thanks for being here once again. So
Thank you.
Our own anthropologist, founder of the Institute, is gone. So we are very thankful to have the anthropology and the leading edge of it represented by you both. Because of course, since Dr. Goodman passed in 2005, and since she was actively teaching in the 60s and 70s, anthropology has really gained leaps and bounds of understanding and advancements and change. So you're bringing us up to date in those realms. So where do we begin? You wanted to find some terms for us because we're really asking, how are the common words used to define this work and all of the altered states of consciousness spectrum? How have those terms changed? What do they mean?
Can we do a slideshow and do a little bit of the history of anthropology on this term? Would that be okay?
Yes.
Oh, yes, please.
So let me do okay, I'm going to turn it over to Todd.
Here, let's get this.
Hopefully this will be full screen. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
So altered states of consciousness and the basic underlying idea of the topics that you introduced and that are so central to our analyses have developed over a long period of time. And a lot of this is really focused on trying to figure out how to ask the right questions. We've got this quote here from Claude Lévi-Strauss: "The scientist is not a person who gives the right answer. He is one who asks the right questions." We've spent a lot of time kind of trying to figure out what are the right questions to ask and how do we go about answering them. And I think that a lot of the advances that you mentioned, Laura, that we have had over the last 20 years or so is because in some ways we're starting to ask more interesting questions than some of the other questions we previously had. Altered states of consciousness itself is a hard term to define. And Paul, I like the definition you gave us, which is useful, but in some ways it's kind of circular. Altered states of consciousness are a form of altered states of consciousness. And that just sort of happens because it really is kind of hard to define. It's a hard thing to measure. So it's one of those things, it's like a lot of stuff. It's hard to define, but it's fairly easy to recognize when we see it in practice. So it's a condition in which the mind is significantly different from the normal waking beta wave state. the way that we normally associate with normal consciousness, it's something different. And it can take a variety of forms. It can be an extreme form of altered states of consciousness in which somebody is passed out or somebody is obviously hallucinating, or it can be very mild, where somebody is in sort of a fugue state, almost like they're daydreaming, and they're just not quite there in the way that we normally would expect them to be. We can enter into these altered states of consciousness through a variety of means. Sometimes we enter into them accidentally. Sleep deprivation or fasting, oxygen deprivation can cause us to not be quite normal. Other times we can enter into them intentionally, hypnosis, for example, or meditation, or ritual practices like what Dr. Goodman taught us about.
I was going to say exactly what Goodman said. And I want to add one more thing, is that in neurology, it's impossible to define consciousness. So there comes a problem too. How can you define something based on what you can't already define? So consciousness versus altered states of consciousness. So and we've had many wonderful guests here with Cuyamonga that Paul and Laura have invited that have talked about this too. So this is building on what they've talked about. Go ahead, Todd.
Now, a common way to do this, not one that Dr. Goodman focused on, but a common way to do this is to use entheogens, so psychoactive substances. And so on the slide here, you see peyote buttons. It's a hallucinogenic cactus. You can ingest those, and people will enter into altered states of consciousness frequently. And below that is Huichol art made by Huichol, who used the peyote. And it's the sort of artistic tradition that's developed around these peyote visions that the Huichol will use. This is a common part of altered states of consciousness of ACS, but not the central component of it. It's just one way in which people can initiate altered states of consciousness, but certainly not the only one, and probably not even the most prevalent form worldwide. There have been lots of ways people have done this. So initially, anthropology did not use the term ecstatic trance, did not use the term altered states of consciousness, or anything quite similar or synonymous with those. But we do see an initial interest in what we would now call altered states of consciousness. Back in the late 19th century, there's a very prominent anthropologist, Tyler. He's the guy who came up with the concept of animism and provided a lot of very useful ideas related to religion that we still sort of talk about on occasion.
First definition of culture, first definition, and look at anthropology. Some consider him the father of anthropology. Go on.
So he, in terms of his work, was looking across the world, and he noticed that there's this very common pattern in which people use a ghost speech or a ghost voice when they're talking to the dead or acting as mediums for the dead or are interacting with the spirits in some way. We would recognize this now as altered states of consciousness. And so here on the slide, we have a quote from him. And here he's talking about this ghost voice, which is very common. This defines the spirit voice as being a low murmur, chirp, or whistle, as if it were a ghost of a voice. The Algonquian Indians of North America could hear the shadow souls of the dead chirp like crickets. The divine spirits of the New Zealand dead, coming to converse with the living, utter their words in whistling tones. Such utterances by a speaking noise are mentioned elsewhere in Polynesia. The Zulu diviners, familiar spirits, are ancestral names who talk in low whistling tone short of a full whistle, whence they have their name of Imaloisi, or whistlers. You'll have to forgive me as I'm reading that. It's kind of messed up on the screen, and so it's harder to read than normal. The Bible even mentions this sort of whistling tone that's being used by mediums. This is found around the world, and this corresponds to a practice even in the seances that folks were using during this time period in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. It corresponds to these altered states of consciousness that allow people to interact with spirits in special ways.
I was going to say, and actually Goodman's work with Gosalea, talking in stuns with the Holy Spirit, and some of her books, she also talks about the similar phenomenon. There's something neurologically going on where causes people to make these sounds. So yes, she would.
He describes it as a trance state that temporarily overtakes the speech centers.
Right. Absolutely.
So even from the very beginning,
that we hear sounds during trance, we hear sounds that aren't there in the room.
And we can
as well.
And we can mimic them and push them out too. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just sort of from the very beginning, we understood that this was a component of a lot of religious experiences. So Tyler believed that these states are derived from dreaming, and he believed that folks who were engaged in this sort of medium work or working with these ghost voices were in some sort of a dreaming state. And it could be a literal dream, like when you're asleep and you're dreaming, but it could also be a dream like say when you're awake. And so he fundamentally gets the idea of altered states of consciousness, even though he doesn't use the term.
Well, interestingly, we call our work a waking dream. And we've had
Yes.
anthropologists describe it as you've got the centers of wakefulness fully on simultaneously with some, but not all of the centers that support dreaming are on, and the two can communicate with one another. So very interesting.
You want to do this one?
I meant to consult with my youngest son who's taken Latin in high school, but trance, that word is actually from the Latin word, and I wanted to get my pronunciation straight because he's very persnickety, but he's not here with it. But it translates to, it means to die, to travel beyond, to go from one state to another. And it was really important in the 16th century when it was used for shipping, and they would talk about the trance across the ocean, or the voyages in trance. And originally it was not used and was not a word for shamanic behavior. So that is the origins of the word trance, but then it quickly gets subsumed and picked up as this metaphor of dying, but also going from one state to another. So anthropologists very soon pick it up and use that.
So from the very beginning of the study of trance and trance states was this idea of travel or transformation from one state to another. Again, the altered states of consciousness, the idea that you're leaving one state and bridging to another. So ecstatic trances. Initially, and again, Laura, I think that you mentioned this, it was initially thought of as a mental illness. People were, so early European explorers, even early anthropologists, were traveling around the world, and they would see folks who were involved in something that looked sometimes like an epileptic fit, and other times would take different forms. But when folks had seen those sorts of behaviors in a European context, they were from folks who something wasn't going on right with them. They had a mental problem, they had a physical problem, there was something that caused them to be ill. And so the initial European explorers, initial European anthropologists tended to view the whole idea of a trance state as a manifestation of mental illness in some way. This is a picture that Franz Boas presented, and he worked against this concept of illness. There were others who really built on his work, but he was saying, and we got to understand this in terms of its cultural context. Yeah. These folks aren't necessarily mentally ill. We need to understand it in the local context of these specific people and think about it differently than normal versus ill. There's something else going on here. So initially, during the early 1900s, people were thinking of the shaman as some sort of a quack, maybe even a charlatan, but certainly as somebody who is a little bit off their rocker, somebody who wasn't quite normal. We see this, for example, there's this article, The Shamanic Practices on the Verge of Insanity, very common sort of perspective that was present throughout the time. This continued clear on into the 1950s. You see a quote here, the shaman is mentally deranged. That's a direct quote from an article during the time period, and was frequently called Arctic hysteria. That was derived from the study of folks to the far north, where people would go through a period of mental difficulty as they initially were becoming shamans. And this was seen as a clear sign of mental illness, this Arctic hysteria, proving that shamanism was, in fact, a form of mental illness. Please.
Right. And I was just going to say, we have a lot of people that work really hard in anthropology and other fields to get rid of this idea. And people start trying to get rid of this by 1923. In fact, we don't have the slide here, but Ruth Benedict, one of our famous anthropologists, she worked really hard against this perspective too, as did Boas and many others. Yes, so I agree with Todd.
Well, you could maybe say that just as the trance states temporarily overtakes the speech center, so it might temporarily overtake the eyes to look upward, focus differently. When you have the some Bushman shamans, they bend over at a certain angle when they're in the depths of their trance. They may fall to the ground. I mean, you could say it temporarily overtakes the body in some ways.
Well, and I think this is what's happening was you had people from a Western or Euro-American or other places on the globe that lost these traditions, but they're looking at a person on the ground seething, or a person that eyes are going up and down, or they're doing something that's not normal, therefore it has to be a pathology or illness. And that, I think that's what really happened with the ecstatic trance, or this trance, was they were looking at them, seeing these unusual behaviors by their perspective, and then thinking that wasn't normal. So a lot of what we did know in the early 1900s until the 1950s was what anthropologists just saw and reported. And then when they asked the shaman about it, then the shaman say, yeah, the spirit sees me. The spirits threw me in a cooking pot and they dismembered me, and then they put me back together. And they're like, wow. I mean, I'm not talking about us, but those early people that were writing about it was said, wow, that ain't good. That's evil, or that's bad, or something like that. So we had all these type of derogatory terms also coming in with that, and that dislike or
vantage point of looking from the outside in, as opposed to the direct experience and looking from the inside out.
Are trying to understand it within its own cultural context, which what Franz Boas wanted to do was look at the history and look at it within its own context. And that was something Franz Boas is considered the father of American anthropology. And he's one of the ones in our field that really led anthropology to try to understand cultures and people on their own terms and not put in your own terms into it. So he's definitely something that we call do not be ethnocentric. Do not take your values, your thought, and judge another culture or another person. So he really built up anthropology, trying to get us to think about the insider's view, and that was really important to him. And also, most of us that are anthropologists today tend to try to understand things within. But we're just kind of going through a history here of how this came about with these terms. So yeah, just looking at that history.
Look at the 1960s studies of Erica Bourguignon in a bit too, and that really put the lid on the whole.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So as these anthropologists were going out and working with these folks, they found that the shamans were frequently the village leaders. They were the folks who were very well respected, and clearly were not crazy off the rockers. They were not. These were highly socially functioning, mentally functioning individuals within their social context who were involved in this. And so by the 1950s or thereabouts, the whole idea of shamanism or trance states or altered states of consciousness as being a sign of mental illness was falling out of favor. In fact, it was largely rejected. So altered states of consciousness then began to be talked about in terms of its basic structure as part of the way that humans interact with spirits, the way that humans are interacting with each other. But it became tied to a larger focus on sort of psychoactive drugs, in part because of changes within the culture as people started experimenting with things like LSD and the drug culture of the 1960s. But even separate from that, this whole idea of this is not a mental illness. Instead, this is reflecting an altered state of consciousness as opposed to a mentally ill state of consciousness, caused people to start to focus in new ways and different ways when approaching these trance states. We have a quote here talking about kind of the shift in terms of how people were viewing altered states of consciousness as not a sign of mental illness, but instead as a sign of something else, in particular in its relationship to psychoactive drugs. This is from Terence McKenna, who was an ethnobotanist and very famous. He was talking in the 1950s here. Life lived in the absence of the psychedelic experience upon which primordial shamanism is based is life trivialized, life denied, life enslaved to the ego, and its feat of dissolution in the mysterious matrix of feeling that's all around us. This reflects a shift from the idea of shamanism or trance as mental illness to shamanism or trance as an elevated state, as a good state, as something that provides knowledge, wisdom, something that is desirable, as opposed to something that reflects a lack of normalcy, as something that is not a good thing.
Well, and this gave the role of, instead of having these shamans as mentally ill, instead you could say, well, their brain's not working like our brain because they're eating this stuff or they're drinking this stuff or they're smoking this stuff. So it changed the locus of abnormality to an acceptable way of understanding this other reality. Yeah, it got very popular. Yes.
So World War I, World War II, especially World War II, had expanded our knowledge of the world and had made it really important to folks to have anthropologists go out and talk to folks that had minimal contact with the Western world prior to this. And so anthropology shifted from being something that was kind of focused on a few places, say in the American Southwest, where we had some Native American groups, to a worldwide endeavor focused on trying to understand humans across the globe and humans throughout the world. As part of this, people became fascinated with shamans, because shamanism and trance states and ecstatic trance were central to what a lot of religious approaches were using around the world, religious experiences.
One of the things you're looking at is R. Gordon Wasson, who had a very famous article in 1950 in Life magazine. He was not an anthropologist, but rather he was someone who became really interested in it. And it's almost like that 1950s made other anthropologists say, wait a minute, we really need to pay attention to this stuff. And then probably most people in this community already know about Carlo Castanada. He got his PhD from, I believe, Berkeley. And his books have been, in his interview with Don Juan and other, have been characterized as he made up a good story, but his story was based on all this type of research, and that's another discussion. But they definitely, through Carlo Castanada, he probably sold the most books that woke up the public's knowledge to this phenomenon and popularized the links between shamanism, ASC, and psychoactive agents. So we're definitely, was after World War II, seeing this shift in thought processes in anthropology. Go, Todd.
Absolutely. So what had previously been seen as mental illness became kind of mainstream culture. I mean, Castanada sold over 20 million books, which is an impressive number. I remember reading several of his books as a young man, and I think the Southwest was filled with people going out there to find their own Don Juan, to become Carlos Castanada of their own. So it really entered into the popular culture in a way that it would not have otherwise. So building on this interest in trance, building on this interest in this idea of being able to enter into an altered state of consciousness to get wisdom, to get insights, to be able to get an experience that would otherwise improve your existence as a human, give you access to knowledge you wouldn't have otherwise. We get research, for example, by Eliade, who uses the term ecstatic trance and defined it as the soul leaving the body, ascending to the sky or descending into the underworld to gain knowledge, to interact with spirits, to do a variety of things. Eliade further states that during the ecstatic trance, shamans report being possessed by spirits or controlled by them. And this is where the altered states of consciousness comes in, or ecstatic trance, using this particular term.
And this is a really thick book for those that have not read it yet or don't know about it. But one of the things that he was really harping on in this book was saying it's not art hysteria. So he early on, and he was actually in religious studies, but anthropologists use him all the time because he did so much cross-cultural analysis that people were looking at this anti-hysteria. But in the New Age group, this idea right here got picked up in the New Age stuff. And so he's also in some ways father of some of the stuff going on with the trance, ecstatic trance being about spirit and spirit possession. Go on, Todd.
Absolutely.
We will differentiate possession trances from ecstatic trances because they're very, very different.
Absolutely. In fact, we'll use that as a segue to talk about that exact point. So one of the things that grew from this sort of research is the realization that all altered states of consciousness are not exactly the same. And there are multiple ways to create altered states of consciousness, to enter into them. And so there's variation in ecstatic religion. There's variation in ecstatic trance, as the terms were being used. And you couldn't just simply reduce it to take drugs, you have an altered state of consciousness, or take drugs and you're doing ecstatic trance. It doesn't work that way. You've got possession, you've got mediums. Those are different from the classically described sort of structure that you see with shamanism. And shamanism, even within what we broadly call shamanism, there are a lot of different varieties or approaches to shamanism. And in fact, there are priests or other religious specialists who enter into altered states of consciousness. And so we realized that there was a lot of variation in what altered state of consciousness meant and ecstatic trance. Dr. Goodman, in fact, was central to this effort, talking about Pentecostals and how that is different from other forms of altered state of consciousness and trance that were going on.
Well, her work in glossolalia found that it was independent of religion and language. that is
Absolutely.
universal phenomenon. Yeah.
Absolutely. So this led people to kind of think about ecstatic religion and looking at the ways in which this ecstatic trance could come into and be a part of religious experience, and recognizing it's not the exact same process every single time. How it started, how it's used, the sort of people who are involved in it, and the role it plays within a religious tradition varies cross-culturally and around the world. So we're not talking about one thing or even one general phenomenon. We're talking about hundreds of different phenomena, which we can loosely cluster into an idea of trance or altered state of consciousness. But it doesn't flow that it's a single sort of experience. Even within the culture, there can be different manifestations of this sort of experience.
And yet there's commonalities. And so you are defining ecstatic religious experience as, quote, a seizure of man by divinity, similar to a shaman saying, I am seized by the spirits. So I think there's a lot more common ground than we fully realize if we're able to diffuse the argument between monotheism and polytheism, or let go of trying to define the spirits and just look at the experience of it.
We agree with you to a certain point, and we'll actually talk about that here in a moment. But you're absolutely right that there is sort of this ecstatic religion, and we can start talking about it more broadly and think about the role that ecstatic trance and altered state of consciousness will play within religious structures. So,
or all the mystics that talk about union with with the all, you know, that's common to our work too. So I just think we take away the barriers, we would see commonalities. Not that's the end all and be all, but we would see them more readily.
Well, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring up I.M. Lewis is he's probably the most referenced person on this subject matter. His original book was 1971, and it's in his third or fourth edition. I think it's his third, the 2013. But he worked really hard on that, and it's something that the scholars are citing all the time. But I think it's important that ecstatic religion and ecstatic experiences was seizures. And so again, going back to the shaman with the outward experience of, you know, grasping for air on the ground, doing this type of stuff, that did not always sit well with anthropologists. And so they started saying we have to have better terms than just seizure. And it's not always leading up or will always cause a seizure. So some of that variation that you're talking about, Laura and others, ends up being thought very in details about whether or not we
there's
should
an epileptic seizure, and then there's enrapturement.
Yeah. And we'll kind of come back to what anthropologists did and why they got rid of a lot of these terms here in a few minutes. Go on, Todd.
Sounds good. Excellent. So transpossession.
There's Erica.
Actually, I'm going to talk about this.
This is Dr. Goodman's advisor, Erica Brillion, and this is the study that Laura kept mentioning in it was 63 when she published it. She got a big grant from one of the health organizations. Sorry, we're getting blinded by the light here.
National Mental Health funded this
right.
one. Yeah.
And they looked at 488 groups around the globe and found that what she was really comfortable using the term trance. Trance was found all over the world. It was very common, but it shifted, and her thought, through time and space. And so with monotheism, what happens is people don't realize this, that divinity, and they start getting away from it. So it shifts through time from what the shamans are doing in those societies to a difference in Western civilization. This is one of her more recent articles before she passed away, but she says that trance or altered state of consciousness, which is linked to possession beliefs, may take many different forms, which I think is important. If such state occurs spontaneously, it may be interpreted in local terms by diviners or other diagnosticians as due to possession or intrusion by a spirit entity. I think this is really important. I'm going to stop here. The idea of people can willingly ask to be possessed. And so Dr. Goodman worked with Pentecostals in Mexico, looking at how Pentecostals called in the Holy Spirit for possession to cause their trance states and speak in tongues. Absolutely. or it can be an intrusion by a spirit entity in which you have something like a demon go into a person. And Dr. Goodman, again, with her work on demonic possession, that's intrusive. It's not supposed to happen. And that takes a very different form than what a Pentecostal will have. And so they're very different in that sense. But here's also another important aspect of both Erica and Felicitas' work. In biomedical terms, these spontaneous states may include such very conditions as seizures, fatigue state, even comas, as well as disassociational states. Some, but not all of these states may be understood as pathology. And so they were still concerned with when you see the ones that are pathological versus the ones that are natural. And they spent a lot of time looking at those, both of these women scholars. Disassociation as a psychological mechanism may occur in the context of a major psychiatric disease such as schizophrenia, and there's no doubt about it. And there's been a lot of anthropologists, even archaeologists, that have looked at art done by people with schizophrenia when looked at how those compare to shamanic arts, and there is some overlap. But we now know, moving fast forward, that schizophrenia impacts the brain in a way that shamanic states do not, and we could talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, in other situations, it may be learned, even taught systematically in the absence of a psychiatric disease. So all over the globe, people that believed in spirits would train and learn and could have, if you will, trance possession or spirit possession by will. You wanted to say something, Laura?
Oh, like Dr. Goodman always said, this is for a healthy nervous system.
Right, absolutely. We'll go on to the next slide. I'm trying to bait on what to talk about next. Okay.
So I don't know, is it better with my hat on or off? It's one of the problems of being a bald guy.
Hat on.
Hat on?
Hat on,
Okay.
because then it shades you from the sun,
Okay.
which was blurring you out.
Fair enough, fair enough. Okay, so going back to your point there, Laura Lee, about how there is some commonality, there's overlap or consistency amongst humans. You're absolutely right. And anthropologists were beginning to ask, why is it that we have this? Not just anthropologists, others who are interested in this topic. We came to realize that studying ASC, or altered states of consciousness, required us to really look at the experience using a framework that looked at how the brain and the body are corresponding to that state. So we couldn't just simply talk about these things as if people have these, just happen to have it. Instead, there was a physiological component to it. That physiological component isn't necessarily the same for every single person. But if I can enter into a trance state and somebody else can enter into this trance state, undergoing the exact same process, let's say sleep fatigue, or let's say taking peyote, or let's say whatever method we might use, the ritual body postures that the Goodman Institute uses, that suggests that there's something about our bodies that cause us to respond this way. And again,
that capacity to do so when given the right circumstances and conditions.
And that in fact underlies the point you made earlier, which is that humans keep on coming back to these sorts of practices. Even if you take the practice away, it's rediscovered in some way, not exactly the same way, but people keep on rediscovering independently of each other these sorts of practices that lead to altered states of consciousness. So again, altered states of consciousness is not a sign of an unhealthy mind or an unhealthy body. It instead reflects our bodies in general under certain circumstances.
And I don't know if you noticed, but we've now gone to ACS, doing altered states of consciousness. In the 1980s, there was a really big battle in anthropology not to use the term ecstatic trance or trance. Some of it has to do with the Latin word and the construct onto shamanism, not understanding it on its own. And there's a big literature on this. And some people thought it was a Euro-American ethnocentric term, trance, because it came from Latin. So people started doing away with that. Another thing was it got tied up to people using trance as mental illness. So we don't want to use it that way either. So people started quickly getting rid of those terms because of all the baggage that got attached to that term is what I think happens. And there are lots of articles we could talk about later.
And it also didn't help that the street drug ecstasy took over the term ecstatic.
In Hollywood, using the
Yeah.
term trance is some sort of whatever.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Woo-woo
baggage,
type of
all
thing
these
too. Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the term altered state of consciousness emphasized its sort of normality compared to a trance, which was seen as abnormal or unusual in some way.
Okay.
So ecstatic experiences. Do you want to talk about this?
Goodman loved the term ecstasy, so she used
Why
it.
don't you talk about the slide for us, Laura?
Oh, gosh, it's one of her books in addition to Where the Spirits Ride the Wind. And she's looking at many different cultures. And she's really trying to find, I mean, what I find her work is so brilliant is rather than appropriate one culture and say, this is the path, she looked at so many cultures and she tried to find what are the essential common steps between them, because they're so packed with detail and unique features, and you can get lost in reading. I find this a difficult book to read because she just describes so many, but it was brilliant to look and see what is it actually, what's the underlying message, what's the common steps. And so her formula for our ritual today is looking at so many, as she was so good at, and distilling it down to what are the simple essential steps, and thereby giving us Westerners a legitimate path back to those indigenous states. We were once all indigenous, even in Europe, where most of us white folk hail from. We needed to find a path that was practiced in Europe. My first interview with her was really about who are my indigenous ancestors. In radio, we were talking with all these indigenous cultures and looking at this, the coherency, the beauty, the grace, all the world is sacred, the justice, the equality. And I was looking at my own culture and going, well, that's lacking in mine. How did we get here? Where are my indigenous roots? I know that we once all shared this. And somebody had called in and said, you should talk to this anthropologist. She has an answer for you. And the first thing she said was, look to the art. Go back to the caves of Lascaux. You will find the artifacts there that we can decode, and you can have direct experience from taking on and standing or sitting in the same postures that are depicted in the world's art. Select artifacts we can decode as ritual instructions. But the ritual that she tied to it was looking at, how do we call the spirits? How do we engage this universe as the intelligent, living, eternal now that those very cultures knew it to be? And so we really do not only have to put a foot in this world, anchored in this world, our world works, but also we can expand upon it. And that's where the beauty of this comes, is that we can also put a foot into these other realms, which she described as part and parcel, two sides of the same coin. These two realities are interwoven, and there's a covenant between them. And that is of long standing use, and that our early cultures who maybe couldn't travel or know the world or have what we have, they had that to explore, to expand their view, to really engage in imbibing the life force and the information that comes with it. Was that good enough, Christine?
Yeah, that's
topic.
Excellent. I think Paul wanted to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say also, the emphasis for her is that let's look at the natural ability within our own physiologies. Yes, we can go ahead and introduce these sacred substances to induce an altered state, but she felt that this capacity is a natural capacity within our own physiologies. And so she really wanted to emphasize that over and over again. Like, this is the one thing she wanted to add to the storyline of altered states of consciousness.
That we have the capacity within,
right, even
naturally.
Though when you say this, people automatically think you need to go do some sort of other substance. And it's true, the substances, they work. It's a sacred means by which people have these experiences.
And not to take anything from those paths, but
Right.
this is a path that actually the only outside agent we invite in
Sound.
is the spirits.
Oh,
We open the door. She felt that without the activation of the spirits, however you want to define them, because then again, no belief system, no dogma,
right.
but you must engage it. And that would be the juice, that would be the medicine, that would be the oomph that takes you there. The doors are thrown open and you have passage because of that.
Yes, I agree. And one of the things I found interesting about Goodman was I was going through the 3 books of hers that I have and several of her journal articles. She really doesn't actually sit down and describe or define trance in a nice way, or ecstatic in a nice way, or ecstatic trance, but she really wants to talk about the experience. And one thing even though she doesn't clearly define those terms, she knows this is an experience, and she knows this based on our nervous system, as in this quote. That's why I like it. She's the only one I can find where she's really throwing out what she thinks about this in a scholarly way for people like me. But, we all have the same nervous system, which you said, Laura, is healthy, but we all have these physiological changes that happen during religious trance, and it's one of the gateways to do that. But at the same time, our cultural knowledge is going to impact what we think we know is happening in that other reality. So it's always tied to our own cultural perspective. So it's the case where culture, body, brain, knowledge all comes together in one thing as we're straddling that reality, the 2 realities, which I find interesting. I think Todd has something to say.
Well, no, that's exactly right. Building on everything that you all have said, the individual experience is the coming together of all of this. So it's the coming together of our bodies, which are in general the same, although there may be some individual variation. Our culture, which is shared amongst people, but again, there may be variation within a particular culture. And then our own idiosyncratic sort of characteristics or tendencies. All of those put together create the ecstatic experience. And there's that both generates the variation, but also creates the consistencies that we see. And so I think that one of the most important insights that Goodman had was this tension between the fact that it is a shared experience while also including the individual components.
Well, and that the spirits come to us in the way that we can most benefit, feel comfortable from, that is instructive. And it's though this language that it speaks to through the experiences is composed of what is most meaningful to that individual in that moment and to the group. So it really is an intelligence in which we interact, maybe filtered through our own brain. Maybe it's us that are composing the impulse or the life force of the information in our own way. It's really a dialogue.
Well, and her book, Where the Spirits Ride the Wind, is excellent because it talks about her personal experiences, but also her students and other people around her, their experiences. And I love that personal experiential stuff in that book. But she was also, and I think this is equally important, and kudos to Dr. Goodman, she was a scientist. And she was an excellent scientist. And it wasn't enough to have the experience and do the practice, but she wanted, from my perspective, reading about her, she wanted to understand what was going on in the brain. And she started doing brain maps. And she was really wanting to understand the physiological, neurological shifts that were happening with and between those states. And so you guys have talked about this a lot with Cuyamonga. You often talk about this stuff at the beginning of each trance Saturday. You talk about it. But yeah, so this is just a preliminary research. This is published in the Anthropology of Consciousness, which is published by the American Anthropological Association. So the fact that she is being published there shows anthropological scholarship. But she looked at how we know through her works and also in Kugler's lab that there are these incredible differences in brain waves from the EEGs, that we do get these waking brain waves are much faster, but we get something different going on. We get a decrease during this. She did blood tests. We get a decrease in stuff that makes you feel bad. I mean, this stuff here, these chemicals make you feel bad. They're related to stress, and that they're really higher at the beginning. They decrease after trance, and during trance they decrease. And by the end of it, you get the really good happy hormone, the beta endorphins. But this is some of the research that shows that. And for this crowd, or hopefully just for me, making it simple, because I like to keep it simple. In practical terms, you all have said so many times, the person has an energetic but relaxing waking dream that leaves them feeling less stressed and otherwise feeling good. And when we get to ecstatic, that joyful happiness that the APA or the American Psychological Association definition that Paul read out the first. I'm thinking back what Paul did. I think it lays right in here. It's this beta endorphin. That's what gives the joy, the happiness, the feeling. So, and you guys will know more than I know. I only know what we do through reading. I never met her, but I think that's where we get the notion of ecstatic trance, is because she, I think, realized it really was so for her, she liked that term, but I think a lot of anthropologists didn't realize that this stuff's going on. So I had an article I submitted, and I use a term ecstatic trance, and I got trashed. And I was told by reviewers, I cannot use these terms. These are terms that were gotten rid of a long time ago. But I'm thinking about writing a feedback or another article, but no, it's right in here is why we can call it ecstatic trance. I'm sorry, down one line. The beta endorphins, that shift.
There was a period of time that we also referred to it as ritual trance postures, ritual trance postures. But when you take out the word ecstatic and you remove that word, you're taking out that energy, that pulse.
Kind of the whole point.
The whole point of the experience. When we just call it ritual trance postures, we lost some of the energy of what the practice is all about. It doesn't properly describe it. And so we went through that whole evolution of looking at how the terms have evolved throughout the history of the Institute and the different names and ways of trying to encapsulate what that experience is. And ecstatic, you can't take that word away. And for us to call it altered state of consciousness
Too broad.
postures.
Too broad.
Yeah.
Bingo.
I agree with you completely, Laura. It is too broad, because there are examples, in fact, fairly common examples of altered states of consciousness that do not produce ecstatic trance. Sometimes, if done in the wrong circumstance or done in the wrong way, or sometimes done involuntarily, you can have an extremely horrifying experience that can socially isolate people, that that does not produce certainly the beneficial effects that Goodman talked about with ecstatic trance. And so altered state of consciousness, that's still an altered state of consciousness, but certainly it's not ecstatic trance.
I agree that this is turf that you need to know what you're doing in order to enter in. And so I appreciate all the cultural containers that have gone through time with the safety nets, the safe containers that it practiced in, the knowledge base, and all of that. And so, it's interesting that even if people say, I didn't have much of an experience, but boy, do I feel calm and peaceful afterwards. That is the bottom line. You enter into this practice and you end up, even if not much went on, if you didn't have a peak experience, the bottom line is, I feel better. I feel more calm and peaceful and comfortable in my own skin, bottom line. And
we always say we're not trancing for the purposes of trancing. We're trancing for the effects on the physiology, on ourselves, on our
and
outer
also
world.
that sense of the ecstasis,
Pulling it
stepping
into the
outside the stasis, the norm, the equilibrium. We are definitely doing that. So that really encapsulates. We liken it to Joseph Campbell and the hero journey. We are stepping across that threshold into the magical realm, have the experience, find the gift, which is that shift that takes place, that ecstasy, that oneness with all, and then the return coming home to share it with the community. It fits so perfectly. But that sense of a journey, this is a spirit journey. You are going somewhere. You are trance, you are transatlantic trance reality, right?
And coming back to,
from shipping to trancing.
back to Todd's last comment. So ecstatic trance is kind of like a specific category of experiences of the ASC world. And the ASC is the broad term. We're talking about a specific
Well, and
pathway.
what it hasn't shared with the mystics that we honor, that we recognize. Oh, yes, the oneness with all, the divine source. I'm one with the universe. That is a peak experience of ecstatic trance that we achieve on a quite regular basis. How is that different from what the mystics, whether it's a Christian mystic or a Sufi mystic or what? I mean, that state of the sublime, of the unity, so easily achievable. It's what else could you call it?
It's the full
I
spectrum.
agree the
of
term religious trance is a little bit dated because you don't need to be part of a religion to get there.
Well, and it has the baggage of religious being,
Yeah, the means, but
but so the experience is all about the full spectrum of the human experience. It's about being able to have that foot in both worlds, that we're drawing both into our
and that's why
normal reality. It's
Yeah.
abnormal not to have access to this altered state, this what we call an altered state. But in from
Goodman said that,
but
and
if you look,
cultures,
if you look
and
out through
practices
human
say
history, that is the normal experience. to
achieving that is the normal.
having both. Yeah.
And you mentioned how good it was, how healing and helpful. Well, to expand, to add to,
Mhm.
and it's of short duration because, as the neurologist Garrett Meyer, who's on our advisory board, told us, being awake is eating up a lot of energy. So is dreaming. You put the two together in this hybrid state, highly active. You're
Yes.
draining the batteries of the body quickly. So it's if you
Yeah.
have a peak experience, you can achieve that state, and it's timeless, right?
Well,
You don't
they've
need
done
more
this.
time. You need to enter the depth of the experience. Go
That's why
ahead,
we have to,
Christine.
that's why we
Yeah.
have to buy so much food at the Institute, because people.
Ravenous as they come out. Yeah, have the food ready.
What were
Anyway,
you gonna say, Chris?
I was gonna say, Goodman reports that it burns up about 3,000 volts. I mean, it's huge. It's like so much higher than normal states, either one. Yeah, it's just huge.
oh yeah, that was
Mm.
this. That was Gutmann, Professor Giselher Gutmann at the University
The
of Vienna.
paradoxical state, yes.
Yeah, paradoxical arousal. And he said that a normal waking state, 250 microvolts brain usage, energy output. In this state, at peak moments, 2000.
Yeah.
Tenfold increase microvolts. Yeah, very interesting. So it's not sustainable this is not your normal everyday state. This is go in, check in, download information, life force, energy, bliss, go about your day.
But you've opened up that doorway, which you do contain throughout the day. Once you open-
Yes, isn't that
that's-
interesting?
That's the point.
Do you want to talk about well, let's first talk about, well, we can get to that. What time is it?
Well, can I interrupt and suggest
Please.
maybe
Yeah.
people might have questions about the PowerPoint show or the history or just general questions, if this
Sure,
might be a good
let's
time for
finish it.
just those type of questions?
Would you like to look through chat?
Well,
Would you like
Emma,
to jump on?
Emma said, can religious be replaced with cultural instead of religious trance, cultural trance? That's an interesting perspective. Yeah.
From an anthropological perspective, the problem is culture, and
Oh.
cultural
Fine.
is more problematic than religion because of
Yeah.
how we define culture and all the mechanisms in culture. And often we think about culture as something really big, but if there is religion, it's over here in a pocket and then it feeds back into it. So again, that would be really tough. I mean, from an anthropological perspective,
I don't even
because
know
of
what
the
that would mean
culture.
either.
Let's,
Yeah.
let's go to
Mhm.
Lawson. Lawson has his
Oh
hand
yeah,
up.
Lawson, you
Sure.
kickstarted this in a way
Yeah,
by,
well,
how has
it's
the
all
term
your
ecstatic
fault.
trance changed? What do you mean by that? Yeah,
Can I do two questions?
you can do
Yes.
as many as you want.
Okay. The first, well, what is it? Actually, the first one's not really a question. It's just a comment. When I was digging around and being inspired to ask you guys this question, I found in Ecstatic Trance, Ritual Body Postures, one of Dr. Goodman's books, she has a little section where she actually does define what she's calling ecstatic trance.
Oh,
Well,
good. Send me the page numbers.
Okay. Can I put it in the chat?
Yes, please. Thank
Why
you.
don't you just read it?
Yeah, I'll read it too. The
We're
quote
traveling, we
was,
don't have our books.
But this is for the postures, right?
yeah, well,
Yeah.
the book is Ecstatic Trance Ritual Body Postures, and I think most of that book is her displaying the postures
Right.
and saying the history of them, but there is like, I guess, an intro section. And she says, today, various kinds of non-ordinary states are summarized under the term trance. This includes everything from meditation to Stan Grof's hyperventilation, a breathing technique like the Indian pranayama, and the techno trance of the youth culture. However, the trance that occurred for the first time in connection with the ability of a religious experience has a different quality. It presented the awakening humankind with the capacity to willfully leave the common reality and to enter another reality, the abode of spirits. To distinguish this from other states of trance, we call this special altered state of waking consciousness ecstatic trance.
Okay.
But then my other question was, I know the idea that it's built into everybody, into the physiology, and everybody can do this makes sense now, seeing it happen every Saturday and Wednesday. But it seems to it seems weird with the fact that shamanism is like a social role. Like if everybody could be a doctor, they wouldn't have had the town doctor in the Old West, or I mean even in the 50s, because you didn't need that. So if everybody can do this experience, why does shamanism, like as a shaman of the town, exist?
Good question.
There's so much literature on this, but what anthropologists thinks, or let's go with what the shaman said. The shaman and their societies say that often somebody is able to see better. And some people up in Siberia liken it to, some people are colorblind. They don't see as well colors as other people. Some people can, if you will, have spirit vision, and they tend to see spirits a little bit easier, and it's not that much of a shift. And so some of the groups have talked about, some people just have a little bit easier time. They're wired, their vision's a little, makes it easier. And I really like Dean's discussion here recently, one of our guests, because there may be something also physiological in our DNA that some people's mind just are working a little different and close it a little more. But I think it's all possible. But some people will have very incredible color visions. Other people will have the sensory. Other people will hear things. And so we also know from listening to people that people are perceiving it a little different too. And so it's something about how we're hardwired, I would suggest, following all this, Todd.
There are also many cultures in which every male or every female or every person is considered a shaman. That may in fact be
Native
a part
Americans.
for example, the Australian Aborigines with their walkabout, in which part of that is to go and encounter the spirit world through an altered state of consciousness. So, but even in those cases, as Chris was saying, there are individuals who show themselves to be particularly adept at that. And so, for example, the Yanomamo in South America, every male will be a shaman, will have shamanic experiences. But there are certain, in particular, older men who are seen as really gifted shaman, and they become the village shaman, even though everyone's a shaman, or every male is a shaman.
Yeah.
And
a lot of that's training too. And so that in this case, Yanomamo or other groups where the male is training with senior shamans, and then they also gift their spirits, their Hekrata to people, and they become better. And it's just like any learning activity we do in education. They do that in South America as well. And so you have the people that are learning more of that craft than the other people.
Well, if I may add to that too, that when we talked to Dean Radden, and he was looking at a chart of some people have sight and some people have kinesthetic knowledge and some people have this and some people have different abilities. So, and we find that true in our own groups. Somebody will have that
visual.
Yeah. And so there's specialists. And you made the point, Christine, during Dean's talk that, hey, in our work, all of those skill sets are there. It just depends on, we find all of it per individual. It can happen at different times. But there's also the role of the shaman who is shamanizing on behalf of somebody, whereas we're not. We're just really shamanizing for ourselves, if you want to call it that. Or I even think of it more as perhaps proto-shamanism. If we can truly trace this back, the 40,000 years to some of the oldest artifacts in a posture that we have. And if we have this doorway that is simply open for each of us to partake of, to answer questions, to gain insight, to have a journey, to profoundly resolve what it is that is needed. If we each have this capacity for ourselves, then some among us may decide to spend the time and the training to do it on behalf of others, but really we're doing this by ourselves for ourselves. And I find one of the great joys of this is to have direct contact with the all, with the spirits, however you define them, with the realm of altered states. I have direct access. I don't need to have a go-between. So if you need a go-between, go to a shaman. But if you don't and you want to go direct, here's a method of doing
But the
so.
shaman is the specialist who's trained and spent his time to be in
Yes.
that role, just like
It's
any
his
other.
job.
If you're
It's his job.
terribly ill, you're not going to be shamanizing
We could
for
all go to
yourself
medical
if you're-
school. We could all go to medical school and become doctors if we really truly wanted to be that.
Right,
But
but that's a
it's a special-
specialized role. It's a
yeah.
full-time gig, whereas
Yeah.
there's so many roles in a tribal society to fulfill.
Yeah, but that's a fantastic point that Lawson's made.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So,
But I just go back to your practice here at the Institute. But there's something probably going on with these postures because they do seem to channel. Some of them have a lot more visuals where others have less. Some of them, I mean, they're giving us different information. And even there seems to be within the groups, these little nuances that is something that Todd and I are really curious about what is causing those nuances. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the very fundamental questions about what Goodman brings to the table. And that is,
Right.
we know that we can sit down and do some drumming and have experiences. We can listen to a rattle and have experiences. Without a posture, we can have trance-like experiences. Now, it's not required to have a posture. What she's bringing to the table is, does the position of the body have any impact on that trance
It
experience?
does. It does.
Yes.
and why?
Yes, it does. And why? And
Mhm.
then we start seeing categories and
Right.
areas of experiences that are magnified by specific positions of the body, becoming like an antenna. And this is kind of like the foundation of everything that we're doing here, is trying to understand the impact of the body.
How does it work? Why does it work?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I also think we talked, Christine and Todd, about looking at cultures and the postures that they have memorized in the forms of the statues. That's how they're delivering from generation to generation, which I think art, I mean, look at how universal this is. And so art being that one universal language, they say it's math is one, but also symbol and iconography. And these artifacts are a universal language as well that's delivering information through time. And so you look at the different postures within a culture, an area, a region, an era, as well as an area. And I think that's going to prove fruitful to see what were they doing and why, what were they seeking and how.
Mm.
And I want to talk to Chinese doctors on meridians and the India chakras. What is it in the physiology that
The
is being
mudras and
activated?
all the mudra.
Yeah.
range,
How does the body position? What are we? Antennas.
So a
Then
couple,
Doing something.
couple comments from the chat room. And see, Cameron says, from my
Let
perspective.
me go back to Lawson real quick. Do we answer
Oh,
your
yeah.
question, Lawson?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was perfect. My new metaphor is like everybody plays soccer, but only some people are getting 8 million euros. to play
Right.
Manchester.
Yeah.
And Lawson, coming back to you for another moment, I mean, as part of your dissertation, your paper that you're working on, does this work for you, this description that we've given you today, to be able to use the term ecstatic trance? And when we call ourselves ecstatic trance postures, can you see that fitting into your work and what you're?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think in the end it's something that's impossible to define, but we're just trying to come at the best understanding that we can achieve, and
Right.
the conversation is really what defines it more than like a single sentence, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think going back to Goodman, it's experience that defines it too.
Yeah. We always say, let the spirits be the teachers through the direct experience. They will teach you the most. So Lawson, we look forward to the report on your survey that you had us all participate in. If you want to put the link in the chat room as well. And then at some point coming up on a Sunday, you'll have to give us the full report of your findings and further.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Lawson did a questionnaire research introducing multiple sounds and seeing what sounds seem to be the most comfortable for inducing you into an altered state of consciousness, using the traditional rattling and drumming that we're familiar with here at the Institute.
That
But
you
it-
contributed 5 different tracks.
And then
Yeah.
but he also took a bunch of other sounds and other types
Yeah.
of sounds.
What's the range of sounds?
So
to be
what
played?
kind of sounds have that impact, that sound, and what works? And so, yeah, that's part of his study.
Very
I
interesting.
think he's had quite a few participants and he's got his data put together. We'll do a presentation on that, Lawson, when you're ready. And,
Okay, yeah. And
thank you.
I can put it in the chat room for sure, but I'm planning to close it out
Oh,
basically at the end of this month. So this weekend
this
and a
is your
couple more.
last call.
Okay.
You call
Final
now
call.
1-800 Lawson. Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. So put
Thank
it in the
you, guys.
chat room, and that will give people an opportunity to participate who have not participated. All
Yeah.
right. I wanted to
chance to
say
do so.
a couple comments in the chat room. The chat room has been moving on me in the meantime. Lawson said, from my perspective, the shamans have a specific job. He, she ferries people from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Cycle.
That's one.
It is his job, their job.
No, reading.
Yeah. And then let me see. Grace said the impact, the position of the body on altered states of consciousness and vice versa in both directions. So it's not just holding the body position, having that impact on altered states, and then altered states having an impact on the position of the body back and forth.
I agree with that.
That's
yeah.
an interesting input.
Mhm.
Let me see. I'm just looking at some other points here. Martha says, are you investigating whether new postures are being developed or created in the modern era? Anything new under the sun? That's a good question.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's a sensitive one because we just don't want to invite people getting too creative with ideas about, oh, I see this thing at the Met Museum and I'm going to make it into a posture. So we're trying to find something that has the stability of culture behind it and follow that path. We have so many as
But
it
the
is.
question is begged, if cultures
Did it
many
pre-
thousands of years ago
Why
could
could-
find
Mhm.
a posture that worked, why is that not possible
We've had-
today? But there is a protocol. So
There's a
Dr. Goodman
protocol.
established a protocol for testing, which
Right.
we often do on Wednesdays.
Sometimes,
Our advanced, yeah.
I will say sometimes within the context at the Institute of a workshop, information and knowledge will come together from a group of participants that will take something beyond what the artifact or whatever we've been given. And there will be some experimentation that we'll undertake. So it's there, it's on the table for discussion.
Emma says biogeometry touches upon these postures. It's all angles.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, that Kurt Wenner will talk about angles and geometry as well coming up.
Yeah.
So, well, I also wanted to touch on the National Institute of Mental Health study survey that Erica Bourguignon, as you mentioned earlier, undertook, and the findings. We didn't conclude with the findings. And Felicitas, by the way, who spoke and wrote 8 languages, was tapped by Erica to help translate many of those ethnographies and take a look at it. But the finding was that the vast majority, something like 95% of those cultures looked at, who report that hearing voices, seeing visions, entering into these states, that it is healing, that it is normal, that it is foundational to their culture, that is embodying wisdom, that it's healthy, that it's just a part of their practice. And
They looked at 488 cultures around the globe and through time and space. So it was a really robust study, especially for the time they did it without modern computers. They had the old big computers, but yes, so 488 groups.
And I mean, this was right when the 60s was revving up. And so it was definitive to help say to Western perspective that this is normal. I want to just recount, I just want to say that they're about the aberrations. Is this forbidden turf? Is this an aberration? We still run into that. We're asked in polite society at dinner parties and, oh, you guys do this interesting work. Tell us about it. Oh boy, do we have to be careful not to step on toes in trying to explain the work. We also do the elevator speech. We'll say a sentence or two. If interest is shown, we'll continue, right? We're not here to lecture. But I will let me recount a conversation that I had with an ophthalmologist who must have been 80 years old at least. And so coming from an older perspective, but oh, my dear, what do you do? I said, well, we enter into these. Oh, that's very interesting. Well, and I said, oh, you're an ophthalmologist. Well, let me ask you about the visual processing center, because isn't it interesting that with eyes closed, another window, another screen opens, similar to what we dream upon and imagine upon. And then we receive these visions that are very vivid, often, technicolor, often, clarity, often, like a very intense daydream. Well, what do you see? Well, they range from geometric patterns to animal spirits, to ancestors, to scenery, to landscapes, and the whole gamut. Oh, the entoptic phenomenon. Yes, we see what kind of my wife, he says, has migraines and she sees starburst. So this is a disease. This is a right into that. If you're seeing things if you're seeing hallucinations, like they're not hallucinations. I can discern this reality from that reality. I'm not mixing up the two. The conversation went south and it was so frustrating. Oh, well, you're just engaging in the migraine pathway of seeing these geometric patterns because she sees it. I'm saying, well, it might be. I mean, we have one brain, mind, right? Design. And if a migraine happens for your wife or any other migraine sufferers, and it's happening along this visual pathway and it's lighting up a starburst was the common one he cited. And I'm seeing entoptic geometric forms. Maybe it's happening on the same neurology, but it's going in a very different direction. I'm not in pain. I'm not suffering. This is ecstatic. This is joyful. This is fascinating. This is instructive. It's got meaning behind it. Oh boy. So, I mean, that you may have felt as anthropologists that they've put to bed this, oh, it's a pathology, it's an aberration long ago. But let me tell you, it's out there in the culture, that mindset that let's hear something outside the norm and it must be over here is very much alive and well out there in the culture. The other problem that I have run into is friends of ours took us in Santa Fe, this beautiful gallery full of Mesoamerican art. They trot us up to the owners. Oh, hi, this is Paul and Laura. This is what they do. Tell me about your work. Oh, well,
okay.
Our elevator speech. Okay. It's about this kind of artwork that we see here, posture, 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 and how this how does it do that? What kind of plant medicine? Well, we're not using plant medicine at all. Oh no, that can't be. These cultures use plant medicine. Yes, they may well have, and many of them did, but it is possible to achieve. No. Oh my gosh, are the closed minds out there? Oh no, I know, I've been there. I've talked with the cultures. I've been there. I've been in there. I've taken the plant. It's the only way to do it. No, it's not. There's many ways of achieving this.
That's what.
And in fact, anthropologically, I would bet that the majority of indigenous societies did not use plant medicine, that they used ritual.
It varied across culture, and there were some cultures that felt using plants was in fact a form of cheating. That was not a good idea. In fact, such not a good idea that you ought not do it, because that will either invite the wrong spirits, or the spirits themselves will look at that and say you're cheating if you want to come.
That's not one of our ancestors. You cannot do that.
Yeah.
And when we did the entopic lecture that is on YouTube that you guys posted, that I did that. I think it's really important when dealing with that we have David Lewis Williams, who's won a lot of awards for his work, but his typology and phases are heuristic, and he acknowledges that. But you have basically stage 1 where you get in topics, stage 2 where the world starts spinning, stage 3 you pop into that other reality. And so I think that that's a construct that's worth thinking about, because we know that I used to get migraines really bad in middle school, high school, and into my mid-20s, and it is painful. And it's like getting stuck in that room with the entopics and you can't get rid of it. And when I in class, sometimes I'll tell my students, it's like you can push on your eyeball and get the weave pattern, or you can have a bad optical migraine and get stuck there. But trance is something different, because you travel, you go traversing into that other reality, and it can be pleasant. It's not the same pathology as a migraine. So absolutely. But I think Oliver,
spoken by somebody who's been to both.
Yeah.
That means a lot. Yeah.
But Oliver Sacks did a lot of that. He looked at Hildegard of Bingen, and he said all those visions Hildegard of Bingen had, those were just migraines. And so we have that in the popular culture. We have these famous neurologists looking at this stuff saying migraine, illness. I mean, and so that is very much alive in the medical community. And he has good stuff. I'm not dismissing him, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
What you bring to the table, Chris and Todd, and what we've been, and what Dr. Goodman really had started with, and that is that this area of research,
Mhm.
this whole area of knowledge that's unfolding itself, she was very careful. She was in fact very offended if anybody tried to put her in the category of New Age. She really didn't want to be considered New Age. She wanted to,
This is
her
age-old
credentials were
knowledge.
there. She'd done the research, she'd done her homework. Don't throw me into that soup, that kettle of soup of all the things that are being just co-opted and manifested from lesser research. And so she took great pride in the fact that she was not that. And I appreciate the fact that the two of you take the risk to go deeper into this world of research, because it's even within your own profession. I mean, there's tons of criticism out there for even going this pathway. And for us not being anthropologists, for us being able to have that the incredible opportunity to hold the tent pole up and find people like yourselves that are willing to take the research to the next level. Goodman left it off. She said, hey, at 90 years old, she wrote this amazing thing in the newsletter. And she just said, I've done my thing. I've enjoyed it. She said, I used the languaging. I used the knowledge of my day. It's going to all change. It's going to grow. It's going to change. It's going to have evolution. I'm so excited to see what you people will find in coming generations.
And where this work will go.
Where this work will go.
Yeah.
And so that's what I feel today, an excitement with the conversation that we're having today, that we can go deep into the work. And listen, we're talking about experiences. In terms of documentation, we don't have a lot of laboratory results anymore. We keep referring to studies that were done in the 1980s. We're trying to do some new stuff now. We're talking about doing new studies. But ultimately, what we're gaining is 10,000 individual experiences that we've been documenting. We're recording and writing down, and people are submitting to us, just over and over and over. We have that data, which, in the old days didn't have a lot of validity in people's minds, but today the subjective experience can be, well, you're the statistician, Todd. I mean, how does that play in today's world?
It's absolutely fine. We recognize that a lot of anthropological data, not just anthropology, sociology, psychology, these things relate a lot to internal feelings or people's perceptions or whatnot. We can observe behavior, which of course is how we are able to get a lot of behavioral information. But when we're asking a question about perceptions or the mind or emotions, we can't directly observe that. Now we can look for telltale signs about different parts of the brain lighting up and stuff like that. But that's not the same as actually experiencing them. So using questionnaires to say, how do you feel about whatever it is, or what did you perceive about blah, blah, blah? Those are essential parts of social sciences at this point. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. There are some dangers, of course. People can just simply make up whatever they want. But that doesn't, using a statistical approach, that does not invalidate the entire research effort. And so using questionnaires to talk about attitudes, feelings, perceptions is a well-established methodology for both ethnology and anthropology, but also for social sciences in general. Using a statistical approach as well, we can start to pull apart the various factors that might be influencing people's perceptions. So we don't need statistics if everybody experiences the same thing, or if people experience completely different things. Well, we need our statistics when some people have experienced this and other people experience that, and so there's an overlap, and we're interested in trying to understand what factors might be at play here versus there. That's where the statistics can help us pull things apart and say, hey, there's a subtle difference here, but it's a meaningful difference, and this is important. So the sorts of research that you all have been doing in terms of gathering these data is, I think that there are going to be 20 years worth of dissertations, theses, and research articles based on the research that you all have accumulated over the last many decades. I think part of it is going back to the very first slide we had. The real issue here is trying to figure out the right questions to ask. And I think we're getting better at identifying the right questions. But we've had several questions here in the chat talking about, hey, how important is the body position? And how does that relate to the mind? And those are some really interesting questions. And we weren't in the position to ask those questions 20 years ago. And we are now in position to ask those questions, but trying to measure those questions creates some difficulty. And so it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of growth, I think, and we're going to learn a lot more in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
And I think Todd's keying in on something really important. With statistics, you have to have a good question. You need to have a question that you can have variables and traits so you can look at those to start analyzing them. So that, again, the questions are going to be paramount for thinking about. One, we're going to have to look at back and forth. We're going to have to look at what data are there and what questions we can ask and what questions are valid and useful that can look at the data. So it's going to be an interesting process to have not only us, but many, many others. Like Todd was saying, this is plenty of room for master theses, dissertations, and subsequent works in labs and all kinds of stuff. The questions are going to be most important.
Absolutely. Lawson's work, it sounds incredibly interesting. And I think there's going to be meaningful insights in terms of what is the impact of different sounds? What's the impact of different beat structure? What's the impact of the various speeds? There's going to be some really interesting insights from all of that sort of research.
Yeah.
Well, one insight that you mentioned, David Lewis Williams and Thomas Dawson and their work looking at, I appreciate their work that they looked at the cave wall geometric patterns and they said, oh, these are notes from spirit journeys. I agree with that. But to say that there's this evolution of the first stage that you see geometry. We see geometry. I've been doing this 25 years, this practice. I still see geometric signs. They're not always at the beginning of a trance state. They show up meaningfully whenever they do, and they have meaning and context behind it. And then to say that animal spirits are just pattern recognition of the mind to put these shapes together into a form that they can, that's ridiculous. I'm sorry. Animal spirits show up in a meaningful way. When an animal spirit has something to say to you or invites you to jump on its shoulders and you take off in spirit flight, there's an interaction there. There's purpose and meaning to an animal spirit showing up. And it has a very different relationship than we do to animals today. We think we're at the top of the heap and that all the animals are lesser beings beneath us, whereas our ancestors felt that the animals recognize that they have abilities and talents and skills and strengths that we only wish that we could possess. Look at supernature.
Right.
Paul's preparing a little talk on supernature here. And that if they're not domesticated, but we have this intimate relation because we share our environment with them, when they are both dangerous and mystical and magical, then it's very much a different experience for animal spirits to show up to us. They show up to us in profundity and majesty and strength and beauty and glory. There is a moment that Felicitas talks about where she was standing with the technicians at the lab where the EEG was taking place. And she was watching the brain waves and she suddenly saw this huge peak of theta going on. And later, and they're noting this. And then they took the person's experience and they tried to correlate what was happening to produce this peak. And she said, well, what happened about 3/4 of the way through where they saw this big jump? And the man with tears in his eyes said, the buffalo came to me and said, you are my son. Things like that would happen, these huge emotional connections to nature, to the sacred, to the creator would happen. That's how animal spirits enact with us. It's like finding an owl in the woods and it looks at you in the eyes before it takes flight and these 6-foot wings. It's just that kind of mystical, beautiful moment that happens. And so for Dawson to say, oh yeah, animal spirits show up because, oh, we have pattern recognition and the geometric forms, it's so ridiculous. I'm sorry. So, look to have the experience to speak through about how this happens. So that's my point.
Well, that's going to be the biggest mystery because we don't really have the words. At least I've not been able to find it. Maybe other people have this, but from the social science perspective, these type of experiences, we don't have words for that. And we tend to think of as we're symbolic creatures, we think in symbols. And that's true. And without symbolic thinking, we can't have math. That's true. And everything in the mind is symbolic. Yes, that's true. But when you're talking about an animal spirit or a totem creature showing up, those are good terms, but we don't understand what that means with the mind and perception and how we're going to analyze it. So, and we've had this conversation at Cuyamonga through the Sunday lectures for over a year now. Seems like almost all the scientists are saying, we need to rethink our terms. We need to rethink our ontology. We need to rethink about epistemology, that there are such big things going on that we're only starting to look at how we're going to study this, because we don't have all the necessary tools in our toolkit to look at this stuff. So it's really exciting. And I agree with you, Laura.
It is all about the
I think
questions.
direct experience is going to be key to that. And so this artificial boundary between subjective and objective in the sciences at particular times needs to disappear. And as we heard from Dean Radden and even Brenda Dunn in the last couple of Sundays, they are saying there is no division. That's just an artifact and a falsehood, because we find that we are influencing the very instruments that we're testing from. We also need to recognize that we have the instrumentation within us to test. This is our physiology. So there is this capacity within us that we call an inner technology. I mean, truly it is a means of detecting and interacting and registering the impact between these realms, these subtle energies. And I've always argued with some of these theoretical scientists that we need invoke anything abnormal in terms of the state of the universe or the laws of physics. It's riding on these very parameters that make up our physical reality. It's here, it's there, and probably the whole animal kingdom is enjoying these wavelengths and communicating with all of nature. And it's probably already there. We humans are the aberration today, I think. And our culture is the aberration. You want to look for an aberration, look at Western culture. We have divorced ourselves from so much, and we're just trying to find our way home again. And this is but one means of many. So
part of what's going on.
Thank you for leading the charge in the anthropological circles that you are. Go ahead.
Tony also had a couple of questions.
Oh, good.
Oh, go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to mention that, and that's part of the depth of what's happening with the ecstatic trance postures, and what we've been able to do with this institute is that our experiences are far beyond what we can describe and what we can document, and where science can take us. Science has come so far up the ladder to reach this other level of experience, and we're just looking to see the two worlds at least come closer together. Maybe never completely, but at least keep coming closer and closer together.
We're looking to expand the worldview so that it can encompass these experiences as normal and put it back to where it began.
Tony, did you have questions? I didn't.
Yeah, Tony, let's hear from you.
Go up. Oh yeah, this is the computer up here.
I'm unmuted here. Thank you. Thank you. Just a quick question. It occurred to me when you were talking earlier, what did Felicitas have to say about Carlo Castanada, who, by the way, was at UCLA, not Berkeley?
Okay, I can remember exactly. One of the California schools.
Yeah.
The foreign land I transverse. No.
Well, I went through the archaeology certificate program there, and one of the professors knew Carlo, so I hear stories.
Do you guys have to know, Laura and Paul, what?
Oh, well, I remember talking to Felicitas about Brian O'Leary, not about
Timothy.
Oh, Timothy O'Leary. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Timothy. Okay, make sure.
Yeah, and the thing is that it felt my interpretation, and I'm putting words in her mouth, that she took great pride in her work, and she felt a little bit competitive, like, yes, but this thing should be done without the other impacted influences. Can be, yeah, that can be impacted. Mm-hmm. But as for Carlos Castaneda, I don't remember her commenting on that.
I don't know. I haven't taken any psychedelics myself, so I really can't speak to that experience.
Right.
But yeah.
But so yeah, I can't.
Our notes.
Yeah, I can't really comment.
So,
on that.
But I'm not even. Go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry.
I would say what I can say as an anthropologist and somebody that studies shamanism, one of Carlo Castanada's office mates was Barbara Meyerhoff, and she did Huichol studies, and she wrote these articles like I impaled myself on the Axis Mundi. So when anthropologists were looking about whether he did the interview of the Yaqui shaman, they thought that some of that work came from Barbara Meyerhoff and office discussion. I don't care if it's right or wrong or what it is, but why those books I think are so compelling is it fits really well with what we know cross-culturally. It's right on the dime, enough that it got him his PhD. So whatever that is or isn't that research, one thing is it patterns perfectly on what we think we know about these topics. So I would suggest that if it's fiction, it is really excellent fiction, that it was passable to their dissertation committee. And it took a long time for anthropologists to snap on something ain't quite right here. But what I think is important is that it makes a lot of sense from all the records we have in the ethnographic record. Let me add though, I don't know of any anthropologist who considers it to be good ethnography or accepts it as legitimate. Right. In the field of anthropology, it has been rejected as an honest account. Yeah. But it does have all the basis of cross-cultural information, and that's why it was compelling. In fact, in some ways, it's too perfect. Exactly. It's a very perfect piece. Yeah.
However, that's what opened up this gateway, this flood of interest. And so the purpose that it served is so significant in history. And that's part of it. We interviewed a lady back in the 1990s, early on, Marlo Morgan, who wrote a book about, what's the name of that book? About the Aboriginal walkabout. Yeah. And so she wrote this book about her experience of going on a walkabout across Australia. It literally, bookstores had people lined outside wanting to buy her book. It was such an impactful book.
After our interview.
Yeah, after we interviewed in at that time in Seattle. And later on, because of the success of the publication, she get picked up by major publishing houses. They had to change the book and list it as fiction, because there was no way to document that this lady actually did the walkabout.
The Aboriginals themselves said, "You're not describing our culture."
Right.
So she got a lot of pushback.
Right. But it was such a powerful story about the Aboriginal way of life. Yeah, exactly. So similar in some ways.
But it didn't follow.
Going back to Carlos, I was more comfortable with the first three books than I was with the sequels on that. Right. And then it became, I thought, more fantasy, but certainly there is something interesting there. And the insights, he does mention insights, and who knows? But they kind of read right to me.
I still love the first book the most, and I read the books. I love them as a kid. They helped create my interest in anthropology, and I think the first book is still an outstanding book. There's a lot of good thought there, even if the ethnography is not supportable. But yeah, I agree with you. The later books just become almost too fanciful. Yeah, too fanciful.
Right.
I find interesting that there is now the big movement to use psilocybin and other substances for therapy. And this is being funded by the government. This is
governments, many across the globe.
The film Fantastic Fungi. Maybe we've all seen that, but it's an amazing film, including work being done at Johns Hopkins and other places.
Yeah, for therapeutic sessions. And so the question has come to us, well, is this comparable to what you do? And I'm like, they're going under for hours, and they're going this deep dive with a guided therapist to uncover this. So no, it's not comparable in that way. But what I find is that we have these little moments of self-applied therapy. And so you have a life review sometimes, and you gain some insight, and a knot that you've been struggling with is suddenly untied, or you have some kind of shift. And it's interesting. We always have to warn people, you may experience pain, nausea, irritability, but it will be fleeting and passing. And we describe it as, Goodman described it as, these are the energy blocks clearing, something to do in your physiology clearing, but it probably is more than that. It's probably just little episodes of insight gained, or self-applied therapy, or spirit-applied therapy. I don't know. So when asked that, no, it's not a deep dive often. Although I did have a pretty profound experience where I resolved a lot of the grief that I held for my father passing away. And it was spontaneous, and it just resolved everything for me. I didn't attempt to go there. I wasn't doing a psychopomp. I wasn't doing anything like that. It just happens when you need it. So I find that really interesting. It happens as you need it, when you need it. So anything else, Tony? Because we're coming to the close of the hour.
No, I think other people may have good questions, so
We
I
got a
think
Thank
we
you.
have to ask that
Let's
one.
go for
Yeah.
those.
We're
Yeah.
coming up to the top of the hour or so, but I do want to get a couple hands
Got a
are
lot
up.
of
here.
hands up.
Tanya and Cameron have their hands up. Let's see, Cameron, you go first, and then Tanya.
You're on mute, Cameron.
You're still
Yeah,
on.
I was only going to say that I was on Tony's question. I went and found a paper that was written by Michael Winkelmann, where
Right.
Felicitas Goodman actually comments on the paper, and Carlos Castanada comes up. All right, so you want to take a look at that? It's in the chat.
I see.
All right,
that.
so that's about, and he's brought up a couple different times, and they cite his work. So if that helps at all, that's what it's
To
there.
summarize what she said. To answer-
Thank you, Cameron. I've opened that up now, so after we get off, I'll take a look at it.
No
Yeah.
problem, man. That's all I had.
All
Okay,
right, thank
thank
you,
you.
Cameron. And then Tanya, I'm gonna have you come on.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning. I was a personal apprentice to Teon Maris, who I think he's call himself a Toltec Nagual, and who's actually, I believe he's the only one who wrote a book, which is a practical approach to shamanism.
Mhm.
Who actually give a guidance instead of like Carlos Castaneda wrote those awesome stories, but there was no practical guide how to get to those states.
Yes.
Where Teon was giving a practical approach and tools how to get there. And I studied with him personally for many years, and we were forbidden to take any psychedelics or mind altering substances. Everything is done through meditation and different exercises, which is train your body to access those altered states without help of any kind of psychedelics.
I'm sorry, what was the name of the book?
His name is Teon Maris. There's a number of books been written by him. He's dead now.
And Tanya,
Thank you.
you're from Russia. Where are you located, Tanya?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Oh, somebody said you were from Russia. I don't. Okay.
Well,
good.
I'm from Russia, but we met at Tony's house once.
Oh, you know Tony. Okay,
Oh,
I see.
Wonderful.
The
Okay.
other anthropologist who gives you instructions on how to do the shamanic practices and how to do soul flight so you can go to the underworld to get your tutelary animal was Michael Harner. He wrote The Way of the Shaman, and he has his own foundation. He's now passed away, but a lot of people have followed Harner, and it's all based on sound induction. So it's similar to Felicitas' work. He does 240 beats per minute, where Felicitas does 210, but there is an interesting contrast there. So we also have those anthropologists that left the field of anthropology to do that practice after studying the Jabaro shaman. Yeah, he actually did hallucinogenics down in South America, but soon found out that more shamans worldwide did sound induction, and that was the method he taught Americans and anybody else on the globe that want to do the practice of shamanism, not just a little bit of the ecstatic trance.
So Harner and Felicitas were colleagues and friendly and knew each other. And he contributed one of the postures that we use from the
Right.
of
Mhm.
Ecuador
No,
that we
yeah,
use. Yeah, with great effect. And we always use the drum for that
oh,
one,
it's this one, yeah.
as opposed to a rattle.
Because
Yeah.
we've touched on the topic several times today, I just want to also express a word of caution that when you use these medicinal plants have to be administered properly through the proper shamanic traditions, and that there is some power here that is not not done properly can be very dangerous. And so I want to just point that out. We have a personal friend, or someone that we're very a colleague, I should say, that has been very excited about our work, went to South America, decided to look up a shaman and go on an experience, and really had a terrible experience from it, ended up in hospital. So I want to make sure that just not all shamans are the same, not all
Right.
medicine plants are the same. That's a whole nother category. It's like the dosages are different for possibly for us Europeans than the people that are traditional. So you may be
Well, and
very,
also a
very careful.
petite woman.
Yes,
That
yeah,
dose should be
all of those
smaller.
concerns. And
Yeah.
that's why, there's a safety factor built in using your own
Mhm.
physiology. If you decide to experiment in the other avenue of having plant-based medicine,
You will never overdose on this method
Yeah.
of
no, but my point being,
ecstatic
if you-
trance postures. Yeah.
just finishing my sentence, yeah. So should you decide that that's an avenue you want to proceed, you want to make sure you have the proper person administrating that whole ceremony, because it's very, very.
Bringing up plant.
Go
Go ahead,
ahead,
Todd.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. When you look at the ethnographic record, there are certain plants that are considered dangerous in and of themselves. But when you look at the experiences people report, the issue that you brought up perfectly there is that when you're using a plant-based approach, you're on for the whole ride. You cannot stop it. And if things are going poorly, you can't just simply open up your mind or open up your eyes and walk away. And there's an inherent danger that shamans themselves talk about in many of these cultures, because once initiated, you're there and you're going. And that is a very different sort of an approach to what Goodman has.
Well, I was going to say, if you look at the ethnographies, shamans will talk about why you have to be specialized in training is to understand the dosage, the powers, the prayers, the gifts. And they also usually in these societies say, yeah, most shamans could do tobacco, it'll be okay, but only a very small percent of the shamans, maybe 1%, can do something like datura because it's so dangerous. And if they administer datura to a patient to make them catatonic to do surgery, that's something the Zuni Indians did in the 1800s. That was highly skilled knowledge. And they also said the plants are spirits and should not be messed with because that's very highly trained, and you have to be ritual knowledge and practice to do those plants. So even most traditional people will be like, yeah, special knowledge, don't mess with them.
Yeah, your point is correct.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, let me add to that a story that we had a friend come and attend a workshop who chose not to actually participate in our trance sessions, but was hearing all the reports during the sharing of the experiences. And later he commented to me, well, I don't know, what I hear in the room being reported, man, I did that in high school with drugs.
Oh.
And I'm like, oh, really? Okay, well, I would beg to differ. You weren't probably with drugs invoking a ritual protective container and calling in the spirits, which are guiding the experience and producing this visionary state to your benefit, to your joy, to your elucidation, to a shift, to purposeful.
Right.
And he said, well, okay, I'll concede that point. But it's interesting that to compare the two, maybe just as with migraines, maybe the drug trips of the 70s, and I'm not comparing these to shamanistic guided plant medicine, which is different category, but people just taking street drugs, which I never did. Just want to make that really clear, that it may be activating the same pathways, right? Because from whence divisions come, if it's not through the optical eye circuitry feeding you, which was what I was trying to ask that ophthalmologist, then where do these visions come from? What an interesting question. Where are they being manufactured from? Where is input to the visual screen are they happening? So a drug trip may, without guidance, produce a lot of who knows what color, whatever, but it's not spirit guided. It's not spirit delivered. Very different. So that was my point.
Yeah. And some of my work in my publication and journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles, as I look at how different iconography, you can really tap into the different ethnogens, what plant medicines were being used because of the differences in the visual visions. And so that's something that I've been working on for 20 years. And I suspect that different ritual postures and different things are going through different channels in the brain is what I suspect, but we really don't know that and we cannot answer that. But we can know that when you take certain medicines or plant medicines, you're going to have certain types of visual things will happen, or auditory things will happen.
Peyote is brilliant.
Yeah.
Dayglow colors, for
Yeah,
example.
and one of the things we know with tobacco is it actually does knock out the optical nerve. So you're not going to see colors, and the brain registers that in the soul flights too. So there's a lot of interesting things we're starting to pull on within at least our science. So that's something that I'm very fascinated with. So I think that the postures may actually kind of like different plant medicines, maybe opening different portals or different channels, different synapses are firing a little differently in the brain or something like that.
I think that's true. And that's why we say you may come in with many different practices, but don't cross wire them. Don't use practice. Otherwise you're giving the body multiple signals and it's like, where am I? Which way?
I'm confused.
Yeah. So just do one. But you're okay. What you need to end? Is that what you're signaling me?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. But I think that, yes, I agree. Every pathway has its own particular physiology in terms of the shift that it produces. And while there's going to be commonalities among them, you get a very different room that you go to, different altered state that you go to.
And coming now full circle.
This is like navigation, right? You know, what do you input into the computers to navigate to get to where you want to go?
The sail ship, yeah.
Yeah.
So coming full circle to the beginning of the conversation today, talking about just where does this category of experience fit and how do we label it? Where are we going with it? We talked about the altered states of consciousness, ecstatic trance. When it was Lawson who brought up the great question to us a week or so ago, just saying, wait a minute, I'm looking through the literature, I'm trying to find definitions. And I appreciate you did that.
How has it changed?
How has it changed? How is it evolving? And in this case, Chris is thinking possibly it comes back around a little bit, that the term has a category unto itself.
And I say it's because we're all practicing it now and it's becoming mainstream. Of course, that's changing.
Well, it's so cool because it does elicit beta endorphins, at least from some of the preliminary tests. So it is a joyful thing.
That alone's worth the price of admission in my mind. It's also going to lower your blood pressure, raise your pulse rate, and induce this waking dream. And it's good to get to know this other part of you that your waking mind is not conscious to. We spend so much time in sleep and dreams. It's good to have that dialogue going. I think that's the delivery pathway. And that's why so many mystical moments happen in dreams. There's some part of us open already.
It's so exciting for me that like I mentioned earlier, and that is that you take your academic background and research and really take a passion and push it forward. We had these conversations with Tony. We had these conversations with you with Gerrit Meyer in Germany, and we're really excited to see where this work can go. It takes specialists.
Cam and Lawson and
Yes,
all the
that's
other
right too.
folks.
And, exactly. And Cynthiana added to the conversation with the dark matter.
Brian Tucker.
Right. So anyway, on and on and on, we've been having these conversations, pushing it. It takes specialists. You know, Laura used to say during the radio show days that our research is a mile long and not a mile deep.
Excuse me, a mile wide and an inch deep.
And an inch deep.
Interviewing 3,000 people, and you've got maybe an hour or two per person. I felt very broad, but it was Goodman that gave us the call to adventure,
go deep,
to go very, very deep. Mm-hmm. And it was Buckminster Fuller talking to Stephen, who's coming up, who said, find what you and you alone can do. That's where your bliss will lie, to involve Joseph Campbell in there as well.
Bliss,
where we thought, this work was calling to us. It was hard to leave a radio crew. I really loved that, but I felt like I interviewed everybody I ever wanted to. It was time to dive deep into one thing, and hers was the path that really meant something to both of us.
Final thoughts, Chris and Todd?
Let's start doing more work.
Exactly.
What do you have in mind? What can you share with us about what you have in mind?
May I just say that if we have any volunteers that want to be a part of the research program, there's opportunities to participate. So it's volunteer based, but we would love to have more participants. I know we have.
I want to bring in Jill and Meredith, who on their own had been doing some interesting studies on biofeedback and who are teachers been in this as long as we have.
I'm talking about also like Carolyn, who's been using time to write things for us, help us.
Carolyn Pokris, we want to honor her and all that she's been doing.
The transcription work, all that stuff takes time. Going back through the last 17 months of all the experiences, documenting, spreadsheeting it, getting it all put together. There's a lot of work to be done. So now back to you,
We need
Chris.
some photo experts too. We have a lot of photographs to process. So back to you guys.
Other than that, we got nothing to do.
Everything you guys just said.
We're really interested in looking at how the brain and the body are interacting with the the process of altered states of consciousness. And I think that's where a lot of our research is going to be focused. And we're looking forward to working with you all and anybody else who is interested. So please
Yes,
do let us know.
volunteers, please, are much welcomed. Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Thank
going
you.
to take a village and probably take several villages to get this thing launched.
Yeah.
A really large village. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thank you two so much. And Chris, specifically, I want to say that your contributions in the last 17 or 18 months has been phenomenal, and we're so appreciative of your dedication, work, and your amount of time and hours on the phone and all the things that you've done.
All the
So,
participation, the various talks, being there in our experiential
Yeah.
sessions.
I'm ready to get back to those. I'm finally got through some hurdles. We'll get back to the experiential.
Chris,
Okay.
Chris was signed up for a workshop at the Institute.
Yes.
COVID came along, canceled all of that, and now she's been online now for every week for 17 months.
Yeah.
So we appreciate that. All right. Well, love to you both, and love to all of you for your participation today and listening. And please email us, stay in touch with us. You can contact at hello@kuyamangayinstitute.com. You can look at our website and continue with this. So we'll look at making this available to people through YouTube and that kind of thing. So anyway.
Perfect. Yep. All right.
So
Thank you.
we
Thank
like-
you all for having
Thank
us. We
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.